So interestingly, we could take more. We could take more students if we had more staff to teach those students to the standard which we think is appropriate. At Manchester, we take less than we could. So what I take from this is that more investment will allow us to take more students and turn them into more scientists. But the trend for people wanting to be scientists is there for all to see. It's positive, it's optimistic. We are getting more applications even in a difficult funding climate. Also, we are globally superb in the UK at research. This is a picture from a Royal Society report called The Scientific Century, actually, which you can download if you want more details from the Royal Society's website, which shows that with 1% of the population and 3% of the research funding, 8% of the world's scientific papers are produced in the UK, nearly 12% of the citations of those papers, and 14.5% of the most highly cited papers, so by this measure the best scientific papers, are produced in the UK. In other words, we are an efficient scientific nation, by some measures the most efficient, and we are also excellent. The reason for that is partly our scientific heritage and the excellence of our universities. This is the worst slide in the world, but it's full of information. It's from The Guardian. Actually, it took me a long time to get it off their website, so I assumed that they didn't want anyone to copy it, so don't tell anyone. It's interesting because I want to put that success in context, and what I'm going to say at the end of the lecture, which is nearly now in context. I'm going to call for an increase in science spending. Why is that? Because it's one of the UK's, if not the UK's, best industry in a sense. We are brilliant at higher education and at science, and it costs virtually nothing. This is called Spot the Science Budget. It's a game you can play. This is the total government spending. It's a great graphic, actually. In 2010-11, 691.67 billion, the total government spend. Spot the science budget. The science budget's that blob there. So that's what we spend. The area is proportional to what we spend. That's what we spend on research. This is what we spend on higher education in general. That's changed now because the tuition fees have come in, so it depends how you count it. Roughly speaking, we spend about 21 billion pounds a year on the university sector, of which about 9 is tuition fees. So the government spends about 12 billion a year on universities. About 3 billion of that is research money that comes in, and about 9 billion is teaching, just to set the scale. So from that, we get something like 43-44% of our economy, in the sense that the government figures show that 43-44% of our GDP is what's called knowledge-intensive services and industry, which rests on that sector. So I would argue, well, it's certainly true that if you obliterated that bit, then the rest of it would essentially collapse, because 40-odd% of our GDP is based on knowledge, which is based at its foundation on that piece of the thing. So what are we to do about that? What could happen? Well, here's my sort of final pitch to you. I decided what I would do is I would write the speech that I want a party leader to give on the eve of the 2015 election, based on the things that I've said, based on the fact that science is not only inspirational and fundamental to our civilization, but it's also a rather good investment. It underpins a large and increasing part of our economy. And I was given the idea for it by two events that happened, or two things that happened a couple of days ago, or last week. One was this, where you've seen on the news this remarkable meteorite that streaked across Russia, completely unseen until it detonated in the atmosphere with the force of several, I think it's 30 Hiroshima bombs, injured over 1,000 people. A couple of hours earlier, by the way, it would have done that over London, which may have injured rather more people. It wasn't seen, and the Russian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee chief said on Twitter, instead of fighting on Earth, people should be creating a joint system of asteroid defense. A very wise thing to say, because as Carl Sagan said, if the dinosaurs had had a space program, they'd still be around. But the other thing was a piece by Andrei Geim, Nobel Prize winner, which I don't seem to be, oh, there it is, which he wrote in the Financial Times, coincidentally, just a few days before that meteorite happened, in which he dreamt, he'd been to Davos. Davos is, if you don't know, a place where social entrepreneurs, billionaires go skiing and wander around being important. Where there's a very famous poet, John Cooper Clarke, said they mix with rock stars he says. Anyway, Andre came back from that meeting and wrote in the Financial Times, "I have a dream. The Industrial Revolution and economic growth continue. This is because astrophysicists find a huge cosmic rock on course to hit Earth in 50 years. This should be scary enough. The world can surely deflect this threat, but we'll need to develop new knowledge and technologies. Finally, in my dream, humans realize social media can make some people very rich, but cannot save the planet. The latter requires new fundamental discoveries." So I took these two things and thought, what would my speech be like? What do I want a party leader to talk about? Well, this is the graph that I hope they're going to talk about. So this, in my life, stood here now in 2020. I would like to see the graph look like this. It's not a great deal to ask. I just think that we should double our spend, our public R&D spend, and we should double the spend that we spend on universities, and we should see what happens. It's a reasonable gamble. What this graph shows is that it seems that business investment seems to follow public investment, so we'll imagine that goes up as well. And that's my challenge. My challenge is that in 2015, a party leader, will it be that one, or that one, or that one, who knows, stands up and says this. I want them to say, we choose to make Britain the best place in the world to do science. Before this decade is out, we will ensure that every citizen will have the right to a university-level education, irrespective of their age or socio-economic background, be it in the sciences, engineering or arts. We will double our spending on universities and tertiary education. Why? Because I believe higher education is valuable to both the individual and to society. In my Britain, every citizen will have the opportunity to leave their hometown and be exposed to ideas. The environment of the university. Society is built on individuals. Imagine a Britain in which everyone you meet knows at least something of Plato, of Bach, of Picasso, of Newton, of Einstein, of Curie, of Archimedes, of Amis, of Mailer, of Mahler, of Dylan, of Lennon, of Feynman, of Sagan, of Armstrong and Aldrin, of Bronowski, of Davy, of Faraday. And further, a democratic society in which voters do not know what it is to make a scientific statement is ultimately doomed. Childhood vaccination policy, our response to climate change, questions about the efficacy of alternative medicines, these are not areas in which a simple opinion is valid. There is evidence, there are models, there is a vast amount of literature which at least defines an envelope within which valid policy actions fall. Column inches by old men whose opinions were once important do not define such an envelope. An educated and informed population is the only way to finally banish the demons of superstition hiding in the darkness. We will double our spending on research. This is Boris Johnson, perhaps. We will double our spending on research and introduce measures to make it attractive for industry to do the same, exceeding the investment in all our competitor nations. That, by the way, is all we would have to do that. We would have to restore R&D spend to 1970s levels when I was born. Why would we do that? Because reaching for worlds beyond our grasp is an essential driver of progress and necessary sustenance for the human spirit. If we deny this innate and powerful urge, the borders of our intellectual domain will shrink with our ambition. We are that most rare and valuable part of the universe, a civilization, and our long-term survival depends solely on our understanding of nature. We will therefore join with our colleagues in Europe, Russia, the United States and China in redirecting defence spending into the exploration of space, to protect our planet from threats, mine asteroids for resources, and expand the frontiers of our civilization for the first time since Columbus. The citizens of our world, one amongst billions in the cosmos, will come together with the goal of expanding our understanding of nature for the good of all mankind. Today, we take our first step on our journey to the stars. And by the way, that's a fully costed policy. It'll increase public spending by about 20 billion a year by 2020, which will be offset by economic growth. Thank you. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. Now time for some questions. We've got 2 microphones. I'd like you to put your hands up and wait till you get a microphone once I've directed it. So, open for questions. And there's one there, and there's a microphone coming.
Mr. Rutherford, Professor, Dr. Rutherford,
I'll be a professor.
Sir Adam Rutherford.
Just do that list of people that we need to be literate again.
Do
the list of people that we will be literate in again in 2015.
Oh, wow, I missed out the biologist.
You missed out Darwin.
Oh.
Dear God, man.
Okay.
Moving rapidly.
You didn't rhyme.
In the front. In the front. Brilliant.
Yeah, Ian Fells from Newcastle. First of all, thank you for a marvellous lecture. I think we all enjoyed it tremendously. And if I make one little tiny point, and done without PowerPoint, which should be consigned to history, just shows what you can really do when you do it like that. Can I just put in one little word for engineers? You haven't mentioned during the course of proceedings, and if you want people that really change the world and really produce GDP, you take somebody like George Stephenson, say, from where I come from, up in Newcastle, or the chaps that built the Hadron Collider, who are actually engineers, and all the rest of it. So I think the engineers, we know physicists rule the world, and they're more important than anybody else, but actually, in conjunction with the engineers, they're an essential part of it.
I actually, it's a very good point, actually. I was going to make some other points. I sort of overran a little bit. One of the points, though, is I agree with you completely. And I think that the kind of almost joke speech I gave at the end, actually, when you think about it, it's not that ridiculous, which is the point about it. Doubling our investment in research, which means, as you say, science and engineering and arts and humanities, I mean all the research councils, is not a ridiculous goal. But I think it will only happen if scientists, engineers, academics of arts, humanities, the lot, come together and lobby government with one voice. I really believe that. And I think one of the problems we've had in the past, particularly in CSR 2007, which should have been a wonderful CSR for everybody, one of the problems, physics had an immense problem. And it had problems, I think, because of lobbying behind the scenes, and we've not recovered from that. Even in the good times, we had a very bad funding settlement, and I think that it's wholly negative to bicker. So I agree with you completely. My statement is that it's the lot. Right? I'm not saying that it should be science. I'm certainly not going as fine-grained as physics, chemistry, and biology. I'm not even going as fine-grained as science, engineering, and the arts. I think we lobby as one for a knowledge economy. I really believe that very strongly. That's the way that we're going to do it. So thank you for the question.
We've got lots of questions over here. Walter, just here.
How do you explain in that nice graph of total GDP that way above the UK are Spain and Portugal?
In which?
You had that graph of the proportion of GDP
total
total spend on research.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the...
So how do you account for the fact that some of the rather less successful countries are apparently spending more?
Well, these are... I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I would argue... Look, whatever I say, that a load of a phalanx of historians and social scientists will tell me there's been many papers written on this, so I'm not going to guess. If I had to guess, I would say that I'd say it's to do with our heritage. As I said, we are the most efficient scientific nation in the world by many measures. And I do think it's down to, my instinct is it's down to organisations like the Royal Society, it's down to organisations like our universities, which are excellent. And I think that a lot of countries have been playing catch-up, and it's very difficult to do. I think we would be far more excellent. I think it's I do think it's an odd... I understand. I mean, at a more complex level. When you read research papers and you read a lot of the work that's done on R&D investment, I agree that it's a difficult problem. And the question, if government knew that investment in R&D would definitely lead to an increase in GDP, I suspect they would do it. My pitch science budget. The science budget's what, ring-fenced at 4.3, is it? 4.4 billion until 2015. So let's focus on that bit. Let's imagine that you decide to take the gamble and have a programme to double the science budget, to restore it back to what it was in 1970 as a percentage of GDP. Then that would, over those years, integrate up to a 4 billion a year extra spend. What's the worst that can happen? The worst that can happen is you waste 4 billion, which is in the noise in government expenditure. It's probably in the exchange rate noise. What's the best that can happen? The best that can happen is you make Britain the best place in the world to do science and engineering, right? And you increase GDP at a spectacular rate, and you transform the fortunes of the country. Now, my 20 billion are also, I'm imagining, that you'd only do that. You say, I want every citizen to have access to tertiary education. Not university education necessarily, but tertiary education. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at the OECD figures, you find that over half the growth in the G20 nations over the last decade came from the tertiary educated sector. And if you integrate it up, so taking account of the big recession that we've had, all the growth in the UK economy from 2000 to 2010 came from the tertiary educated bit, which is not surprising, because that's the bit that we can compete at. So that's why I argue that not only should we take the gamble of increasing research spend, I think we should take the gamble of saying, how could we pledge to make our workforce better in the tertiary sector? How do we get more people into the tertiary education sector? So I think it's, you're right, if you could write it down in black and white and say, this is the increase in GDP from that R&D spend. Social scientists argue about this all the time, other than to say that there's a positive correlation. But what the correlation is, they don't tell you. But I think it's a reasonable gamble, isn't it? Have a go. That's what I'm saying. Come on, George. Have a go. Make us the best place in the world to do science and engineering and see what happens.
I'm going to take two more questions, one here and the second there.
Much to my delight, you mentioned the Royal Institution, more science than I can. And of course, one of the things the Royal Institution pioneered, and I think particularly Faraday, was not just engaging with the public, but really engaging with children. And we know that children at a certain age, 7, 8-year-olds, are very enthusiastic about science, and yet somehow by the time they're 16, a lot of them have lost that enthusiasm. What do you think goes wrong, and what do you think we should do differently?
Well, my area of expertise is not with 16-year-olds, so it's anecdotal, my evidence. I don't know what the data is. Anecdotally, though, and I do go into schools and I give big schools talks, and I find real enthusiasm all the way through. I gave a talk recently associated with something called the Big Bang Fair, which is a big event that goes on at Excel, and the school have won a talk from me, and that was a 13, 14-year-old age group. And when I said who would like to be a scientist, about half the hands went up, and I find that's my experience. So I'm not sure anything does go wrong. As I said, it seems that applications are up. I think that we could take more scientists into the university sector than we can possibly do, because we haven't got enough staff, we haven't got the lecture theatres, we haven't got the commitment from government to fund that, although that is changing. I don't want to be too negative about this government's performance. I didn't say, some of the figures are relatively impressive. $1 billion has come back into capital expenditure, for example, that was cut under the previous government. And the flat cash settlement, although it's going to result in I think something like a 600 million drop in the science budget by 2015, is still flat cash. So I don't want to be too negative about it. But I think that it's about, for me, it's about messaging in a way. One of the reasons I've written quite often that I think someone, and George Osborne did, stood on this stage, I think, and said, we will make Britain the best place in the world to do science. One of the reasons I think that filters through. So I get the sense when I talk to kids that a lot of them, you hear, I'd love to be a scientist, but I'm not clever enough, or I'd love to be a scientist, but it's too difficult, or I don't think I could get there. I'm not. So the messaging, first of all, it isn't too difficult. You don't have to be a genius. It's for boys as well as girls, of course. And if you do it, then if you want to dream, if you want to be an astronomer or a particle physicist or an aero engineer, you want to build satellites, you want to part, as we're doing with ExoMars. Do you want to go and work on that with Astrium or whatever you want to do? Then those things are available to you. Those jobs are there. I think that's very important, and that's part of it. And that's why, for many other reasons, cutting PhD places is idiotic, because that messaging says that you've got to be brilliant. You've got to be the top 0.001% or whatever to get through to go and work at CERN. But everyone goes, I went into physics. Actually, I wanted to be an astronomer. I did astrophysics initially. I went into physics to work at Jodrell Bank. That's actually what I wanted to do, because I used to visit Jodrell Bank as a child. So I think we've got to, when you build this ecosystem and you start providing proper numbers of PhD places, which we don't do, they're reducing, which is idiotic for so many reasons, and we start giving that message out that you can be that thing that you dream about, I think you'll get the flow. I've no doubt that the enthusiasm's there, but it's just about simple messaging. And probably the main one, as I say, is it can be done. You can do it. There are places if you want.
And our last question here.
Hi, I'm going to ask you a very leading question. Do you think it's enough to merely increase the amount of spend on science, or do you think we also need to restructure the way the money is allocated? I'm just thinking, at the moment, certainly in my field, the trend is very much you have a 3-year grant, a 4-year grant, which means that 2 years into your current research, you're already having to kind of divert time from the day-to-day business of doing science to writing your next grant proposal and thinking about how you're going to sell that. It seems to me that a more efficient way to do it is to trust people to do the best science, in the same way that the Royal Society is good at this. They trust their fellows to just do the best science. But I don't think that's the way the larger scientific funding community is set up at the moment.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I should say, I benefited hugely from the Royal Society's University Research Fellowship scheme, which meant that so I'm in my 8th year now, so I finished this year. But the first 5 years before I started making television programmes seriously, I worked on this thing I just mentioned, this FP420, this diffraction idea at the LHC, which is probably going to go ahead at some point in the future. The documents are there, the research has been done. I had freedom to do it, and I only had to put grant proposals in for the money to build it from PPAR, because it was then an STFC, and not for my career. So my career was essentially defined. Also, when you get a URF, then you get tenure essentially, or you should do at the university. It's not guaranteed, but as we all know, that's the idea of the scheme, isn't it? To create scientific leaders. So I agree with you completely. I think that it goes back to the question that you asked about would doubling the research budget do anything? What would you do with the extra money? There's accountability for public money. But I agree with the sentiment of your question entirely, that it seems to me to have been demonstrated, it's obvious, time and again, in study after study and historically, that R&D is a positive benefit to society. Obviously, scientists and engineers drive innovation in society, and the more you shackle them and the less exploration they do, because the more form filling they do, then the less value for money you'll get. It seems to me completely obvious. And I think, I could go further, but it's on the web and things like that. I mean, I just find it ridiculous. I speak to colleagues who, talking about the REF and things like that, who say that they spend, let's say, 5% of their academic time filling in those forms, right? So that means that by abolishing something, probably more, by abolishing those things, you could increase the productivity of UK academia by 5% with the stroke of a pen, seems to me. Why, if you said in any other way, I know how to increase productivity by 5 or 10%, you'd do it. Now, that might not be popular, and there are probably, I don't know, but I agree with you completely. I think that we're demonstrably efficient and excellent and contribute a great deal to the country, and I think people should stop making us fill in forms and let us get on with it. There we are.
So clearly that's our last question. I want to thank the audience, both here and in the overflow rooms, for coming. I want to thank those on the web for listening, but most of all